Coming up, disrespect for the DHS, and my 2 cents on the first 100 days of the new PUP government.
You're listening to Brent's 2 Cents, the semi-serious thoughts of a guy in Belize. And now here's the host of this podcast from somewhere in Belize City, Brent Toombs.
Hey, welcome to the podcast for the week of February the 22nd. Well, this particular episode of Brent's 2 Cents is not likely going to be popular with many of my true blue PUP listeners. I have 2 main topics that I want to talk about this week, and neither are going to be particularly flattering to the new government. Last week, the Briceño administration completed its 100th day in office, and that's an important marker when it comes to the analysis of any new administration. I'll share my report card for GOB a bit later. But what I want to talk about first is what happened to Dr. Marvin Manzanero, who is either the current or former Director of Health Services. Now, while his actual status may still be up for debate by the Association of Public Service Managers, what is crystal clear is Dr. Manza is not very popular with Minister of Health and Wellness, Michelle Shabat. As you likely know, Dr. Manzanero contracted COVID-19 back in December, and he had a pretty rough go of it, even spending time hospitalized on oxygen. In his absence, Dr. Melissa Diaz-Musa, the sister-in-law of Kareem Musa, was appointed Acting Director of Health Services, leapfrogging 2 Deputy Directors of Health Services to take over the boss's office. Now, nepotism may be the easiest explanation for Dr. Diaz-Musa's sudden rise within the Ministry of Health. And for a deeper dive on my opinion on apparent nepotism throughout the Briceño administration, take a listen to last week's episode of this podcast if you've not done so already. Now, a lot of people, including the Belize Medical and Dental Association, are supportive of Dr. Diaz-Musa being put in charge of the Public Health Department. And I'm not here to debate her qualifications. Rather, I want to talk about why Dr. Manzanero has been pushed aside in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, I don't know Dr. Manzanero personally, but I have dealt with him professionally a few times over the years when I've worked on videos about HIV. And I always found him to be extremely professional, accommodating, and candid. Like most Belizeans, I became much more familiar with the good Dr. Manza during the first 7.5 months of the pandemic, as he regularly graced our screens to update the nation on the COVID-19 situation, giving us the unvarnished truth about where we stood and where we were headed, and what we needed to do to try and keep the spread of the virus under control. What I most admired about Dr. Manzanero during those regular information sessions was that he would occasionally express when he didn't fully agree with a particular policy or course of action decided on by the National Oversight Committee, but that as a member of said committee, he was only one voice, and that he looks at issues from a purely medical point of view, and that there are other social and economic factors that the NOC had to consider. Frankly, it was refreshingly mature to hear someone tasked with being the face of a government response being so transparent. Dr. Manzanero's demeanor brought us comfort, not because he told us what we wanted to hear, but because he was honest about the situation. And he was matter of fact about what we needed to do and what sacrifices and lifestyle changes would be required to live with COVID-19 until we could one day defeat it. But it appears his candor, or more likely his integrity, would ultimately be his undoing. In my opinion, Dr. Manza's demise was a fait accompli on September 23, 2020. That was the day when the Director of Health Services reportedly tendered his resignation rather than violate his sacred oath to protect patient confidentiality by sharing the names of COVID-19 positive patients with police. If you remember, SI 134 of 2020 included a provision that ordered the DHS to provide the police with a list of everyone who tested positive, and failure to do so would result in the Director of Health Services being charged with an offense. 3 days later, Dr. Manzanero rescinded his resignation, and a few days after that, a brand new SI was signed repealing the provision requiring the DHS to betray the confidence of COVID patients. Dr. Manzanero stood his ground, and no less than the Attorney General of Belize and Minister of National Security Michael Parafit, a man that no one would ever accuse of being easy to push around, blinked first. But it appears it might have been a Pyrrhic victory, because the government in waiting was paying attention. And I don't think they liked seeing Dr. Manzanero show that his principles were non-negotiable. The UDP's Minister of Health, Pablo Marin, was a disaster. The electrician was clearly in way over his head, and it seemed like he was more concerned about who got contracts to provide medications and equipment than he ever was about trying to fix our crumbling public health system. But at least when it came to COVID-19, Pablo Marin was smart enough to stay out of the way of Dr. Manzanero and his team of technocrats. I think history will actually be quite kind to the UDP for how the pandemic was handled for those first 7 months. But then, in September, a new wave of infections really began to spike, coming at the worst possible time. Election time. There can be no doubt that the election campaign and the celebrations that followed the PUP's victory on November 11th were super spreaders that set the table for December, the worst month to date for COVID-19 fatalities and transmissions. Over 150 people perished in the 6-week period following the election, including David Dido Vega, the PUP candidate who defeated Pablo Marin in Corozal Bay. Yet, despite all the data to suggest otherwise, the new Minister of Health, Michelle Shabat, refused to accept that the election campaign played any role in the massive spike of infections. On December 23rd, he told Channel 7 in an interview that 5,000 new cases of COVID-19 since November 11th had nothing to do with the election because we were well past the 7 to 10 day incubation period. As if the Minister of Health could not grasp how the virus is spread exponentially. Now, fortunately for the minister, Dr. Marvin Manzanero was by this time already on sick leave with COVID-19. Otherwise, a reporter might have asked him for his opinion about Minister Shabat's denial that the election campaign had anything to do with the rapid surge in infections. Because if anyone had been able to ask Dr. Manza for his assessment, I think the Director of Health Services would have given an expert opinion, and that would not have been well received by his political boss. And that's what I think made Dr. Manzanero unwelcome at the Ministry of Health and Wellness. You know what they say, the people may have their say, but the politicians will always get their way. And it certainly looks to me, based on what I've observed during the first 100 days of this administration, that the ministers in Briceño's government, especially our Minister of Health and Wellness, expect to get their way no matter what. If you didn't happen to see last week's episode of Jules Vasquez Uncut on Channel 7, do yourself a favor and look it up on YouTube. In fact, I'll put a link to that in the description for this episode. Jules' guest was Dr. Fernando Cuellar, a well-respected physician who has never been shy about speaking his mind. A big part of their conversation involved the saga of Dr. Manzanero and the way he was given the bum's rush by the Ministry of Health and Wellness. Now, Dr. Cuellar did talk about his own concerns with Dr. Manzanero's management style, and he seems to be okay with him being replaced as DHS, even if he doesn't like how everything was handled. But for me, one of the most enlightening bits of information that Dr. Cuellar shared was how he has removed himself from participating in a COVID-19 committee, because he says that no matter what the experts recommend, the politicians ultimately do whatever they want. And this is exactly what I was talking about last week when I said politicians were padding boards and committees with relatives and cronies because they put a higher value on loyalty than expertise. These ministers want yes men and yes women who will tell them that they are always right and make them feel like they are the smartest person in the room, even when they're not. They want a director of health services who will stand there like a deer in the headlights and stammer about how ivermectin has been proven to be effective in other countries without actually offering any evidence of the sort. Because the Minister of Health just casually mentioned that ivermectin was now an approved treatment while wrapping up his press conference to inform the nation on what a great job he is doing. They want a DHS who won't have an issue with the minister granting himself discretionary power to approve social gatherings that exceed the legal limit. They want a DHS who is not going to remind them that the last election caused the virus to spiral out of control, and that the current SI will expire on the day before the municipal election, and it needs to be extended, regardless if that will play well or not at the polls. They want a DHS who, when the next spike in infections begins, won't be at odds with what the members of the Economic Recovery Steering Committee want for their businesses. And that person is certainly not Dr. Marvin Manzanero, not based on what we all witnessed in 2020. So, on Monday of last week, Dr. Manzanero, who, in title at least, was still the Director of Health Services, returned to work after recovering from COVID-19 for the past 2 months. According to reports, Manzanero arrived at the Ministry of Health and Wellness only to find out he no longer had a vehicle, or even an office, not even a desk. And to add insult to injury, reportedly the minister did not even bother to meet with Manzanero. Instead, it was other higher-ups in the ministry who informed Dr. Manza that he was being demoted, and that he should either accept a new position elsewhere or resign. The story changed a few times during the week. He resigned. No, he didn't. He'd been demoted. No, he can't be demoted without a process. And by Thursday, the CEO in the Ministry of Health and Wellness, Daisy Mendez, told the media that Manzanero had not only been aware of restructuring for some time, but that he had met with Minister Shabat and had willingly agreed to return to the HIV response unit. And that his only concern was that he be able to report for work in Belmopan and not Belize City. A real kumbaya moment, right? No, because the very next day, Love FM reported that they had confirmed that Dr. Manzanero accepted no new position within the ministry and was continuing to report for work at the DHS even though he had effectively been locked out of the office. Meanwhile, the Association of Professional Senior Managers has taken up Dr. Manza's case because according to the APSM, any transfer within the ministry would first have to go through the Public Service Commission. But it's clear that the Minister of Health and Wellness wants Manzanero gone, and he is determined to get his way even if it results in a wrongful termination suit. And just in case I needed any more evidence that the shit-canning of Dr. Manzanero is politically motivated, I was appalled in the last week to see a few people who I thought were above petty political partisanship start to attack Manzanero on social media, leaving cryptic comments like, "You don't know the full story," or "Wait until they show the tape." Bullshit innuendo intended to suggest that there is much more to this than just the desire to change how the health department's response to COVID-19 is being managed. Well, please, let's hear the whole story. Let's see the tape, if any exists. Because right now, all I see is character assassination being committed against a man who deserves a hell of a lot more respect than he is getting from his boss.
We want to hear from you. You can find Brent's 2 Cents on Twitter and Facebook at 2 Cents Belize, or email us at podcast@oshaproductions.com. That's OXA Productions with an S.com.
Last week marked the occasion of 100 days in office for Prime Minister John Briceño and his PUP government. 100 days is a big marker for any administration. It's when a government is considered to have been in power long enough that they can be honestly assessed, good or bad. Typically, a new government will have some sort of agenda for its first 100 days. Prior to the 2015 general election, the PUP released what they called a social contract with the people, promising to accomplish a list of things, including raising the minimum wage, providing free education from kindergarten through sixth form, and university scholarships for any student that maintained a 3.5 GPA. All in the first 100 days. Well, of course, the UDP won that election, so we'll never know if the PUP, led by Francis Fonseca at that time, could have accomplished anything on that wish list. But this time around, the PUP made no such promises for the first 100 days, which is understandable because when you take over governing a country during the worst health and economic crisis in its 40-year history as an independent nation, well, your hands are going to be full just trying to keep the lights on. Literally. So we may have to wait as much as another 4 years and 9 months to find out if the PUP manages to create those 50,000 jobs, or build those 10,000 homes, or roll out NHI to 400,000 people, or even just raise the minimum wage to $5. But for now, let's just look at how the first 100 days has gone for the PM and his government. And before I begin, I feel like I need to point out that I'm not a political partisan or a supporter of any party. In the past, I have voted red, I have voted blue, and I have voted green. However, I never disclose how I vote in any election, and it's not my intent to sway anyone to vote for any particular candidate or party in the future. I'm just an independent-minded Belizean who loves to talk about politics and who believes that the only way we will get better governance is by demanding it. So, how do I feel about the first 100 days? If I was to give the government a letter grade, what would it be? I think I'd have to give them a C-, maybe a C. A passing grade, but barely, with much room for improvement. Now, where any new government usually gets good grades, especially in those first 100 days, is for corruption, or lack of it. That's an easy A when you get swept into power by an electorate that had become fed up with years of corrupt activities being committed in plain sight by ministers and their cronies who had become so drunk on power that they believed themselves to be untouchable. That's not to suggest that I believe the new government is squeaky clean. But at least during the honeymoon period, corruption is not yet entrenched, and any hustling that may be occurring has not come to light yet. If nothing else, it's a time of blissful ignorance, which is a welcome relief for now. Another area where I will have to give the government some credit is for simply keeping the lights on. No, I wasn't making a joke when I said the new government would have its hands full with that. I'm serious. Belize is in a full-fledged debt crisis, and that includes a ton of money that we owe Mexico for the power we get from them every single day. Now, it's going to be a few more weeks before the PM presents his first budget, and we learn just how dire the situation is. But for right now, every day that we don't have rolling blackouts is a good day. Legislatively, I think there's really only one accomplishment worth lauding during the first 100 days, and that's the reconstitution of the Public Accounts Committee and the restructuring of the PAC to put control of the committee out of government's hands. In theory, that's a great move that should provide a much-needed check and balance on the spending of public money. Now, there are a few areas where I have been disappointed with the first 100 days of the Briceño administration, and these are areas where I would give them failing grades. First, I give them an F for not closing loopholes or putting a stop to practices that they seemed to find so objectionable while they were in opposition. For example, there is still nothing stopping the awarding of contracts to political appointees that will long outlive the life of an administration. That's something that should have been on the agenda for the first 100 days, considering that municipal elections were coming up so soon after the general election. Limiting the power of ministerial discretion is something the PUP promised in their manifesto and could have achieved by statutory instrument by now. Instead, the Minister of Health and Wellness signed his own SI, empowering himself to grant exemptions to the restrictions on social gatherings. So that's a hard F as well. In terms of social programs, specifically economic relief and assistance for people most affected by loss of income due to the effects of COVID-19, that too gets a failing grade. Now, it may be unfair to grade the government so harshly when the country is broke, but the fiasco of changing the name of pantry to grocery bag and then leaving hungry people twisting in the wind for weeks was not a good start. I'm not going to give any grade for crime. 100 days is not enough to assess whether the new government is winning or losing that battle. However, the recent spate of violent crime, despite the continuing curfew, should be cause for concern. And I don't feel like the Minister of Home Affairs has presented any sort of plan to improve the crime situation. Now, certainly intercepting 680 kilos of cocaine and arresting 6 people at the scene of a drug plane landing has to be considered a feather in the minister's cap. Except for the fact that 2 of the people arrested are police officers, and a third is a member of the Belize Defense Force. In the 3 weeks since that event, there has been no comment from either the minister or the commissioner of police about whether or not these arrests have led to any new information about who else within Belize's security forces may be on the payroll of drug cartels. And finally, the biggest issue where the PUP government will be judged not only for their first 100 days, but likely their first few years, is the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I'm not going to rehash my first segment and tell you where I think the new administration is messed up. I'm pretty sure I made myself perfectly clear about that. However, the official statistics for the last 30 days have been miraculously much better than they were for the first 70 days of this regime. And even though I remain skeptical that the situation has not improved as much as the daily infographics suggest, I can't deny that there has been a recent reduction in hospitalizations, and we are finally starting to see consecutive days with no deaths reported. So, I'm going to give GOB the same grade for their response to COVID-19 that my grade 11 algebra teacher, Mr. Adams, gave me. That's a standing granted. That's neither a pass nor a fail. It just means that you did the work, but you haven't demonstrated that you've learned enough to move on to the next level. Okay, before I go, I have a couple of Belizean podcasters I want to big up this week. First, I want to give a shout out to Renisha Gentle, who has been dropping new episodes of The Gentle Perspective exclusively on YouTube lately. Renisha did a great episode last week about how to return children to school safely, and part 2 of that podcast will be premiering Monday at 7 p.m. So depending on when you are listening to this podcast, the latest episode of The Gentle Perspective might already be available. And second, I want to welcome Paul Schmidt as the latest member of the Belize Pod Squad. Paul's podcast, The Opinionated Cruffy, debuted on Sunday, and I can't wait to hear it. The only reason I didn't listen to it yet is because Paul's topic was also the first 100 days of the new administration. So I wanted to get my own thoughts recorded before checking out whether or not he and I are on the same page about how things are going for our new government. I'll post links to The Gentle Perspective and The Opinionated Cruffy in the description for this episode. Remember, you can be part of the podcast movement in Belize by sharing Brent's 2 cents with at least one person who otherwise may not know about it. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a huge favor and leave a 5-star rating and review on your podcast app. Those things really help a podcast like this to get noticed. And don't forget to subscribe to all the great Belizean podcasts on your favorite app so you never miss an episode from any of us. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at 2 Cents Belize. And don't forget that you can always leave a voice message for the podcast about anything you want to talk about, like how you feel about what happened to Dr. Manzanero, or how you think the new government has done in their first 100 days. You'll find that link in the description for this episode. And that's going to do it for episode 26 of Brent's 2 Cents. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode. But until then, please continue to wear your masks, wash your hands, stay home as much as possible. And most importantly, be nice to each other.
Brent's 2 Cents is a presentation of OSHA Productions, Belize's affordable professional video production company.